right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And thank you for inviting me to come today. Um, so I actually know a couple of you on there, Brother Engel. So good to see you. I've had lunch with Brother Engel. So so glad to see some of you that I know and some of you that I don't know. My name is David McCurrach. I'm I tell you what, I'm going to share my presentation real quick. I'm going to just kind of walk through this, and I'm going to go through, I've got a quick presentation, probably about 20 minutes or so, just with some principles inside of it. And then I'd be happy to do a Q&A afterwards. So let me share this. And I'm going to do the thing that I always, I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm finishing a book right now called Two Callings, One Purpose, Thriving Bivocationally. And, I'll never forget, I was in Texas. I'm from Texas. And I was sitting with a gentleman who everyone on this call would probably know, but I'm not going to say what his name was. And I remember listening to him talk about the evils of working a secular job. And as he was talking through it, I understand his positioning around it, that anything that takes away from the Lord is not good. But I couldn't figure out, like I had to work. So even though I was kind of getting this instruction that this was not something that I should be doing, I mean, if I didn't work, I didn't eat. So, I mean, I had to work. And so I began to really kind of wrestle with this early on because there was kind of this stigma that if you were going to be a real minister, then it was, you needed to be full time. And I'll tell you, I've been in ministry now for 30 years, and I have never been full time, ever. So I've never been full time. I have always been bivocational the entire time. And now I'm really at a point where I really believe that what God has done in my life from a bivocational perspective is part of my calling, part of what He has called me to do, and it has helped make me the person that I am, and allowed me to do the things that I've been able to do because of that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I'm finishing a book called Two Callings, One Purpose: Thriving Bivocationally. It's going to be out in August is the plan. But if you've ever written a book, then you probably know that the best laid plans of mice and men don't always happen. So I'm trying my hardest to get it released by then, but I'm not the world's best writer, so it has to go through a lot of edits. So I'm going to kind of sum it up for you in this presentation today. Oops. Okay. So a little bit about me. So I have two sides. I have a professional side and a ministry side. And from a profession side, I work for a company called Adobe Software. Most of you probably have heard of that. We're really known by our product Photoshop or PDF. I don't work on that side of the business. I work on their digital marketing side. That's digital media. So whenever I introduce myself and they say, "Well, where do you work?" I say Adobe Software. I always get people saying, "Well, I have this question about Photoshop. Well, I really don't know how to work Photoshop. So, like, you can probably answer questions better than I can about Photoshop." And then the other question that people say is, "So, tell me, why do I constantly get this upgrading of PDF on my machine?" And I'm like, "I don't know that either." So if you need to talk about digital marketing, I'm your guy, 100%. But the things that Adobe's really known for, Photoshop and PDF, I'm not very familiar with. So, but I do manage. So sorry, hold on. I manage a North American team. This says 140. I was just told last week they're adding an additional 57 people to my team. So I'm right at almost 200 people of mostly North American, and then a global team. And so I manage managers that manage managers that manage managers that manage people. So that's kind of what I do for Adobe. And so I'm more of a senior leader at Adobe. And that's going to play into what we talk about a little bit later on. I've been there. I've been at Adobe for 16 and a half years, and I've always worked remote. So where I'm sitting in my office at my home, I have always been a remote worker. I've never gone out. Well, I went into an office by choice for a year when I lived in Manhattan, New York City, before we moved to St. Louis. But that was a choice that I had at the time that I made. But I've always been remote. And the reason I bring that up is because when we think about working, there is different levels of working, right? There are different levels of positions. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. But that's what I do from a profession side. From a ministry perspective, I'm a church planner. The church that we're planning right now, I don't have the best timing, but I am a church planner. So we launched this church 2 weeks before COVID hit. So we launched the church, had two Sunday services, and then shut down for a year and a half. So don't have the best timing, but I am a church planner. I've been planning here in Florissant, Missouri, now for about 4 years, almost 5 years, but I don't count about 2.5 of those years because we were in lockdowns. We were in lockdowns a lot longer than most of the country was. I'm a mentor. I love to help people. I believe that our job is to build great people, not institutions. So I take a different approach. Like I don't know that God hasn't really called me to build a church. He's called me to build great people, and the byproduct of that may be a church, right? And so I focus on building great people. And so whether it's in the ministry or within my profession, I want to help people become better. And then I get to speak. I get to speak all over the country. Now, the irony of this is that I really have a huge fear of public speaking. So like before I got on this call, I had to go on mute for a little bit because I had to take deep breaths and I was make sure I don't pass out. And every time I get up to preach, so I have a huge fear of public speaking, but I think that's how God's sense of humor works because all I do in my life is public speak. That's it. I mean, whether it's, at church or it's here or it's, the college brings me in regularly to have these be special speakers at classes, or I'm meeting with the CEO of Coca-Cola. I mean, I'm always public speaking, but I have never overcome my fear of public speaking. And again, that'll play into what I talk about a little bit later. So if I fall out of my chair, I've just passed out. It's okay. I'll get back up. Okay. So when we talk about two callings, one purpose, I have to really think about a couple of scriptures that are really, really important to me. One is Jeremiah 29:11, that God has a plan. He really does. Now, it doesn't always feel like he has a plan, but he really has a plan. And he wants to bless us. But those blessings sometimes come supernaturally, where I'm just sitting here and they just happen. But mostly, as you look throughout the scripture, God asks us to do something and then he blesses it. And so when I was wrestling with this whole thing about, am I a real minister if I'm bivocational? Because again, I'm going, we should be careful what we tell people because that really impacted me. I really thought that, I really wrestled with that for years, around whether I was doing the right thing or not. But God has a plan for us. And that plan is specifically limited not by our situations and not by our knowledge, but simply by us and our ability to learn to be extraordinary instead of ordinary. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. But so my computer's freaking out a little bit, so I apologize. And then Deuteronomy 28:12, the Lord will open to you his good treasure, the heavens, to give the rain to your land in its season and bless all the work of your hand. That God promises us, and I have lived on this scripture, that whatever I put my hand to, God's going to bless. Matter of fact, one of the promotions I got at work, and part of my testimony is that I was sitting in an office with a gentleman in Montana at our corporate headquarters. His name's Steve Daines. He's now the senator from Montana. And I applied for a job that I knew nothing about. I was totally not skilled with it at all. I had I mean, I just had no experience in it at all. I just applied for it because it was on our internal job board. And it was a worldwide director of something called professional services. And I remember, and I sat there and I walked into his office. They had to interview me, which I didn't know. But since I was an internal candidate, they had to interview me. So they flew me from Dallas to Montana to our corporate headquarters. I walk into the office, I sit down with Steve Daines, and he looks at me, he looks at my resume, and he says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm applied for a job." And he's like, "But you're not qualified." I said, "Well, that's kind of my life. Like every job I've applied for, I'm not really qualified for." He says, "Well, what makes you think that I'm going to give you this job?" And I looked around his office and I noticed that he had all these biblical sayings on his wall and, trust God and all this stuff. And I said, "Well, Steve, let me tell you, God blesses everything that I put my hand to. So if you give me this job, he will bless, this job will succeed." And, the sigh in his breath and the roll of his eyes were deafening at that moment. And he said, "I can't give you a job because of that." And I looked at him and I said, "You can't or you won't, because that's different." And he said, "I won't." I said, fair enough, fair enough, right? You won't give me a job because of that. At that moment, the CEO walked in. His name was Greg Gianforte. You may remember him as the congressman who, when Trump was running in 2016, he got into a fight with a reporter and body slammed him. That's Greg Gianforte. But that's not really what happened, but we don't have time for that in this story. But Greg walked in, he's CEO of the company. He's now the governor of Montana. And he comes in, introduces himself to me, talks to me for like 2 minutes. I'm in the middle of my second sentence to him, and he turns around and walks off. Very odd, very bizarre. Anyways, about 2 weeks later, they called me. Steve called me and said, "I can't believe we're going to do this, but we're going to give you that job." He said, "Greg really liked you," which was bizarre because he left in the middle of my second sentence, right? But God can do anything, right? And so here, I don't even know what this job still is. He never told me what it was. Like, I still have no earthly idea what the job is, right? But I start working this job. I figure it out because God blesses everything we put our hand to. I'm up in his office about 3 weeks later. I asked him, I said, "Well, listen, why did you hire me?" Because I'm obviously I'm not qualified. And he said, "No, you're totally not." He said, "We had a weird thing happen with this role." He said, "We literally had no one else apply. Everyone looked at the job and said they weren't qualified. You were the only person who applied for the job." And and so that's why I got the job. 2 years later, it was the most profitable division in the company. We built it from 3 people to over 300. So God can do anything. Like when we read these scriptures, like I believe it. I have got testimony after testimony after testimony um, of of where I'm at today is only by the hand of God, and it's because I believe God has put that my profession has been a calling that has worked hand in hand with my ministerial calling, hand in hand, hand in hand. And I have stories, oh, so many stories. But let me start with just saying this. I I have I barely made it out of high school. I have no college. None. So I barely made it out of high school. I've got severe dyslexia, so it's really hard for me to read. It takes me a long time to read anything. I've got attention deficit disorder, so I get distracted. And so I'll start reading something in the middle of me reading. I'm thinking about 12 other different things, right? And then I get done reading and I don't remember what I read because I was thinking about 5 other things. And so it makes it complicated. So trying to go to school was very, very, very hard for me. And I had this huge fear of public speaking. So I almost didn't graduate high school because you had to give a public presentation in my English class on a book report to graduate. And I passed out 3 times trying to give it. So wherever I'm at today is only because of my ability to trust God and for him to make a way inside of my life that is a supernatural testimony of where I'm at. Because I've never taken a computer class. I've never taken a leadership class, but I manage a technical sales team in a Fortune 15 tech company, and I lead a large team of people. That is what God can do if we trust Him. If we're willing to step out of the ordinary and trust Him to make us extraordinary. That has nothing to do with me. If it were up to me, I'd fall on my face. So I think that brother brother Watt said, is that right, brother Watt or Watts? I may mess that up.
With an S.
Okay, Watts said this, but if you look at nationally, when you look at churches, 49% of the senior pastors are full-time. Then you look at youth pastors, which is actually the second biggest category of full-time ministers. It's 34%. Assistant pastors is 18%, and other ministers are 7%. When you look at the United Pentecostal Church, now this is just my ability from the survey stuff that they did to be able to, pull out some numbers. The best I could figure, 34% of our senior pastors are full-time, 9% of our youth pastors, 11% of our assistant pastors, and 4% of our other ministers. So what this says is exactly what Brother Watt says, is that the majority of people who are licensed inside of our organization, whether it's the state organization or the national organization, they're going to have to be bivocational. And that being the case, what my theory is that if I'm going to have to spend an hour not focused on the Lord, then I want that hour to be as impactful as possible for provision. So I can go somewhere and I can work for $10 an hour, which is not a bad thing. If that's not bad. Or I can go somewhere and I can work for $1,000 an hour. And the only limit between those two things is us and our ability to think and look at it as something, as a calling from the Lord. Because God can do anything. I am a testimony that God can take anyone and do anything with them. Trust me. So I'm not going to go, I did this for a Bible college presentation, but when we talk about a calling, kind of what is a calling, it's a strong inner, impulse towards a particular course of action, especially when accompanied by a conviction or divine influence. So when we look at that, we think, yes, definitely my ministry is a calling, but that also fits into my profession can be a calling too, right? That I've just got to find the right thing where I have an impulse towards it, and or I'm passionate about it, and then I've got to put all my effort towards that. And when I do, God will bless it, because what He's called us to do is to go out and to reach the world. And to do that, God uses all avenues available to us. So He uses supernatural avenues, but He also uses monetary avenues. He uses people that we can connect with. I just found out that I found out last year that Adobe will sponsor our community outreach, and they're putting tens of thousands of dollars a year into our community outreach because of my job, helping us to be able to reach out into the community and impact the community through classes. We call it life skills. And they're increasing their giving to that organization this year to even more. And so we just can't imagine what God can do when we're able to kind of get into that place where we look at this, at our life, different parts of our lives, as callings rather than curses. And that's the challenge. People are like, oh, I just hate that I have to work. I wish I could be full-time. Well, I wish I could be full-time too, but I mean, my church is like 40 people, so I'm not going to be full-time. And truthfully, I'm in such a good position from a work perspective with my flexibility that I think I'd rather have other people be full-time than me be full-time, because 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 I I really enjoy the mix that I have, and I feel that I balance it pretty well. If we look at the Ecclesiastes, this goes back, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. And this is really key, is that you just got to put, you just really got to commit to saying, okay, listen, if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do it with everything that I've got. Because I do believe that God calls us to it. It allows us to be a witness. I can come talk to you today and I can encourage churches. I get to go to churches because not only are we as ministers bivocational, but think about our Sunday school teachers, our outreach directors, all the people inside of our churches that are actually bivocational, because we're asking them to head ministries and to work, right? And so it's not just the ministry that's bivocational, it's the leadership inside of our church that's bivocational. And so if they see that God will do that for me, then he'll do it for all of them, right? And so it lifts the faith level up. If I went through how I got to where I'm at today, you would just be shocked. But God's built a testimony as a witness as to what he's able to do. And then whatever we do, we got to do it with excellence. So you asked me to come on and do a presentation. Like, I'm not the world's best presentation builder, but I'm going to make sure whatever I present, that I'm doing the best that I possibly can. And so I'm not really good at making slides, but God's blessed me and I can hire someone to make slides, right? So so I wish I could create graphics like this, but I can't. But again, we got to do everything with excellence. And then we got to really trust God for the miraculous. And so this is the part that's the most important part. Okay, so listen, if I offend anyone on here, I want to say up front, I am sorry. I love everybody. I'm just talking about me, and I'm simple. Okay, so I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. So the way I explain things are very simple, but I have Bible to back this up. So I'm gonna talk about this, and then I'm gonna talk about the Bible to back it up. The challenge that we have is that since sin entered into our lives, we at that point began a journey towards ordinary. And what God wants us to do is to become extraordinary. The challenge is that there's a box that gets built around us that keeps us in the ordinary. Now, listen, I just made this up, but this is how I see it, okay? First of all, fear. Fear is one of the sides of the box that makes us ordinary. The second side of the box is the people who we surround ourselves with, because those people are either helping to douse that fear or they're stoking that fear, right? Because someone comes to you and says, hey, listen, I want to be president. And you're like, oh, well, why don't you think about something a little bit more, I'm using that as a crazy example, right? But is it really crazy? Right? But we do. So we find ourselves in a position as an influencer that we become the side of someone's box, or the people who influence us become the side of our box. And then that drives doubt. So oftentimes our influencers drive doubt, which stokes fear. And these are the things that begin to box us in and limit us to what we think we can do. Because when it's a calling, I mean, when we talk about a calling and I talk about our ministry, we would never limit God, right? We believe that God can do anything. And so in my ministry, if you're sick, God's going to heal you. And if you need provision, God's going to provide for you. But then once we step out of that into what I call our second calling, which is our profession, we totally limit God. We say, hey, I don't have a degree, so I can't go do that. Right? Or I don't have experience in that, so that's not possible for me. And what we do is we begin to put these sides around the box that begin to pigeonhole us into a certain area, and then also our past. So the failures that we faced in the past, the things that we faced in the past, these four things I find keep us in the box. And what God wants is for us to get outside of the box. Because in the box we're ordinary, outside of the box we're extraordinary. That's where miracles happen. Now here's the weird thing about this. Believe it or not, God provides in the box. He does. God blesses in the box. We have good church services in the box. And there's a story for this that is biblical that proves this out. If we think in the Old Testament of when the children of Egypt were leaving Egypt, and we think about it, I mean, they kind of volunteered to be slaves, right? But God's calling them out because they came for the food and stayed to be slaves. But God's calling them out. And so he calls them out. They're repentant. They move out of Egypt, and their past, that old past there, is chasing behind them. They get to the Red Sea, and the sea splits open. Of course, that's the typology of baptism. So they go through the Red Sea, and God waits till all of that which held them captive gets into the Red Sea, and then he washes it away so they no longer have to look over their shoulders. And then the fire falls from heaven and begins to guide them to the promised land, which is a typology of the Holy Ghost, begins to guide them to the promised land. And I don't know. Again, I've heard a lot of people say it was 3 days journey. I don't know if it's 3 days or 30 days or however many days it was, but it was a few days journey from where they crossed the Red Sea to the promised land. And in that amount of time, they were overcome by fear, doubt, their past, and the people around them saying, we can't do this. It's not possible. Now, they just got delivered out of Egypt. They just walked through the Red Sea. They've got a column of fire by night and smoke by day. They got a rock following them around. They got manna on the ground. I mean, all this is happening, yet they are still so far in this box that they can't see what God really wants to do with them. And so he sends them out into the wilderness for 40 years. So now they are firmly in the box of ordinary, but they're having church. God's doing miracles. He's providing for them. So you can learn to live inside the box of ordinary, right? Their clothes didn't wear out. Things were happening, but that wasn't where God intended for them to be. He would allow them to be there, but that wasn't where he wanted them to be. Where he wanted them to be was he wanted them to be in the land that flows with milk and honey. And so when we look at this, what we have to realize is that our society builds that box around us. Our circumstances build that box around us. And when we become of the age to work, we will oftentimes be limited based on our ability to overcome the different parts of that box. And if we do, then we can have an incredible testimony of the amazing things that God can possibly do. If we don't, then we will be ordinary. We will have done what we could do. And so what we have to do is we have to encourage people to learn to live extraordinary. And part of that is understanding God. So this goes to every level of the church. My church is really bizarre because they have all kinds of testimonies about, God promoting them here and God promoting them there and them getting this job they never thought that they could. But part of that's because I'm an influence in their life. Like I'm telling them, I'm challenging them to go do it. And it has blessed our church. Like we are, for a church of 40 people, we're doing pretty good financially, right? Because we got a bunch of people who God is supercharging their careers to be able to move the mission forward. And we give, a lot to ministries. So anyways, so learning, part of that's understanding God. Our challenge is that this is how we think about life or our plans. Like I always say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him you got a plan, right? Because I believe that makes him laugh. Because this is how we plan. And then this is how God's plan is. Right? Oops. That's God's plan. And so what we do is we preach about the top plan, and then people live the bottom plan. Or we you know what? And so helping people realize that, so I'll give you an example. So, failure is a necessary part of success. If you aren't failing at something, then you are living way too comfortable. You should be pushing yourself in everything that you do to a point where things don't work. Because failure isn't bad. Not failing fast is bad. Riding the anchor of failure to the bottom of the sea, that's what you want to avoid. Not having a failure means that you're really not pushing yourself hard enough, because things shouldn't always work if you are. And when we begin to understand that, we can begin to accept and realize that it's okay to take chances. It's okay to go out and to do things, because in that jumping off the cliff chance that I take is the opportunity for God to create a bridge, or for God to send me a parachute, or for God to put a giant pillow down at the bottom of the whatever you want to say, right? It's like it's the opportunity for God, when you're in a situation that only God can move on, that he does. And then all of a sudden you've got a testimony. And so listen, I have had lots of failures. Like, I've failed way more than I've succeeded, but the successes I've had have far outweighed the failures that I've experienced. And I'm okay with failure. I'm okay with it. I just have learned, I learned how to spot failure fast, say, ouch, that hurt, and then move on to the next thing. So when someone's looking for a job, or they're trying to figure out their career, or they're, wanting to do something in the ministry that sounds crazy, um, my poor pastor, like, I just didn't know any better. So I just did crazy stuff. Like, in my head, the missionary came in from Mexico, Brother Dross, and said, we don't have any tracts. So I decided we need to print 1 million tracts in Spanish and drive them down to Mexico. And my poor pastor, who I ran through the ringer, but I loved him so much, he was like, well, you think you can do it? I said, I know we can do it. We serve a God. Of course, I had no idea what to do, right? And so, but time after time after time after time, we would do these things, and they would create these testimonies inside of the ministry in our life, that are things that, when people can argue about the Bible with me, they can't argue about these testimonies inside of my life. So this becomes a calling, because it becomes a part of my life, of who I am. And then that part of my life impacts and affects other people. That's why I like to engage with people, because when I get engaged with people, I'm able to stretch their faith. I'm able to help them, right? I'm able to encourage them. So I got to go quicker. I'm sorry. I'm almost done. So God's desire is this, right? God's desire is for us to find, is this. He wants us to find balance inside of all the things that we're doing. The challenge is that we often approach things like this, right? How many plates can we get in the air? And then how fast can we run between the plates to keep them spinning, so none of the plates drop and none of them break? And so, we're running, we're running kind of crazily. And then that's where the scripture comes, Ecclesiastes 3:1, goes to everything there's a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. That God has an order. And if we'll focus on that order and we'll focus on uh allowing God to move within our life instead of us kind of running around crazy, then what we'll get is we'll get these incredibly big testimonies. And so I believe that this is something that I live by, is that there's an order that I've got to make sure that I always maintain. And the and I'm very strict about this. So I've got an executive job, an executive level job, and I could easily work 80 hours a week. I do not work 80 hours a week. Um, but I maintain this list right here. My relationship with God has got to always be number one. My family has to be number two. The ministry is below my family. Now, listen, as ministers, sometimes 2, 3, and 4 get mixed up. We put our ministry above our family. We put our job above our ministry. We've got to make sure that we're always keeping this order correct inside of our lives. Because if we don't, then we'll have all sorts of turmoil inside of it because we're doing things out of order. And what we're doing is that center column where we're trying to keep everything spinning instead of really keeping things balanced on with the Lord and allowing God to do that. And then everything else falls after number 4 for me. So, oops. So with that, there's 3 key takeaways that I want everyone to take with them. This is also the QR code for our Facebook page. You can scan it, join our Facebook page. As the book gets ready to come out, I'll notify everyone that it's coming out. But the 3 takeaways are this. I look at bivocation as a calling and a blessing. It is not a labor. Because if I make it a laborious thing for me, then all the people in my church who are bivocational are going to feel that way about their jobs. And then it's going to bleed into their ministries. So my Sunday school superintendent, everybody. So I've got to look at bivocation as a calling and a blessing. I am the largest tither in my church. I am. I probably haven't looked at it lately, but I probably tithe more than the majority of my church put together. Right. So, I mean, it's just a fact of life. I've been very, 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 very blessed. And it has allowed us to do things that normal churches our size aren't able to go do. And so it is a huge, huge blessing. And because of the flexibility, because I wanted my cake and I wanted to eat it too. I not only wanted a career and a good job, but I wanted it to be flexible. So I can go to my job. First of all, I have unlimited PTO. So I can take any time off that I want. I during the day, in between meetings, I can go repair the wall of the church and then come back and do another meeting, right? Tomorrow, I'm going to be renting a 61-foot lift to fix our steeple, between 3 meetings that I've got. So I'll come down, do the meetings, go back up, do the work on the steeple, come back down, do a meeting, go back up and do the work on the steeple. We are only limited to what we can think of as far as what God can do if we look at it as a blessing. Then we've got to trust God for the miraculous and not be settled for the normal, the ordinary. But we got to trust God for it to be the extraordinary. God wants to put a testimony about every aspect of our life, and that includes our vocation. And then we want to maintain balance between God, family, ministry, and vocation. We've got to keep that set up. So these are the 3 key things that we've got to do. So I told you that I don't have a degree, and I am very pro-education. My wife has a doctorate in counseling education. My son-in-law has a doctorate in something else, and my daughter has a doctorate in, I don't know, organizational leadership. I mean, everyone around me is a doctor, right? Except for me. They all have more degrees than a thermometer. But, but I never did. And so when I go into a meeting though, I'm in a company that everyone in the company, or just about everybody in the company has degrees. So when I go into these executive level meetings, the way they introduce themselves is kind of weird. They say, yeah, my name's, John Doe, and I'm from Princeton, and I'm, Jane Doe, and I'm from Harvard. And it comes around to me, and I'm like, I'm David McCurrach from Richardson High School, and so they actually, in the meetings that I'm in, they stopped on purpose doing that because I don't think they want to point that out that I don't have a degree, right? And so my boss has his PhD, or my old boss who had his PhD, stopped asking everyone to introduce themselves like that. Because when it came to me, it just, anyways, but that didn't limit me. I had the largest team within that organization by threefold the largest team. And so even though I'm the least formally educated, I am the largest leader inside of the division of the company that I work inside of. That is only because of God. That is what God can do if we do these three key things, right? All right. So with that, we got about 15 minutes left, and I talked a lot. So I apologize. You probably don't believe I have a fear of public speaking, right? Because I talk so much, but I totally do. I'm still nervous.
Amen. Well, thank you, Brother McCurrach, for wonderful insight, and I especially appreciate the towards the end you're talking about the importance of balance, because it's such a critical thing, and sometimes a challenging thing in bivocational ministry to get it right. And so all of those that are on the call, you are certainly welcome to ask questions, maybe get a little bit of detail on something, ask about a particular aspect of thing. As a reminder, everybody is on mute. So if you would like to ask a question, you will need to manually unmute yourself so that we can hear you ask the question, but we want to hear the question. Sometimes people do like to also submit a question via the chat. So you can submit a question via the chat. I'll be watching that as well. Yes, sir, Brother McCurrach.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm absolutely 100% an open book. Like, I'll answer any question that you have, because I really believe this. I really believe that God, we can do anything. Like, we really can do anything. So any questions that you have, 100%. Don't hesitate to ask.
All right.
Brother
Somebody,
McCurrach,
there we go.
Brother McCurrach, we're already friends on Facebook, but the book that's coming out that you're putting out, is it going to be promoted through your personal Facebook page, or is there another?
So yeah, I'll send Brother Watts a link to my Facebook page that's for the book, and I can send that out. But yes, I'm going to promote it through both my personal and also
Okay.
the book Facebook page.
Thank you. Thank you for what you've said tonight.
Yeah.
All
What?
right. Somebody
Brother
else.
Delaney.
Oh, Glenn
Brother
Delaney.
Del-
Okay, Brother Delaney.
Just if you would, I know you talked about balance. One thing that I've encountered in the past with some people is if they have to work bivocationally, as most of us do, um, I'm in sales, and that's been a great thing for me. But I've had others that kind of felt guilty about going out and selling a product when they feel like they should be selling Jesus. And can you speak to that from your experience? Help
Yeah.
that.
Yes. So this is part of the wrestling that I had. But what I have experienced over the years is the impact on lives that I've been able to have inside of my company has been huge. Like, the people that I've been able to impact and to put my fingerprints on have been really, 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 really big. My employee score, if we were to do, like, stars out of 10 for my organization, which normally the larger the organization, the worse your scores are. But my scores are around 9.7 out of 10, because I get to personally mentor and impact people in my profession that have led people to church, that have led people to, not my church, but other churches, that have led people to begin relationships with God, that started a journey for them that has evolved. I have someone from my first job who credits his whole walk with the Lord to the fact that I took time with him to talk to him about biblical principles and to love him when he was an atheist. And so, for me, it's wherever I'm at, that's where God has called me to minister. But I have to balance that out with the fact that I have to establish a relationship with someone before I start to really, and they have to invite me in. They have to invite me in. And so that's very true in every aspect of ministry, and including your vocation. We're only limited in our vocation to impacting lives based on that box of being ordinary versus extraordinary. The fear, the doubt, the people around us, our past limit us in our ability to be able to minister to people that are around us, because we oftentimes think that the only way, I mean, listen, I didn't grow up in church. I hid underneath a car because this girl kept inviting me to church when I saw her coming, right? I only went to church so she would leave me alone. And that was like, that changed my whole life, right? So, but my point is that, I have to look at anyone that I interact with as a God-called interaction. And when I look at it like that, then I don't have, I'm working right now. I got a new boss, and I'm working right now. I'm going to go down to Austin here in a few weeks, and I'm going to be his friend, and I'm going to talk to him about principles, and I'm believing God's going to create a supernatural relationship between the two of us, and that God will do that. So I don't see any divide between the two.
Wonderful. Wonderful. A couple of great questions that have come in on the chat. One from Brother Probst. What additional advice do you have for pastors whose secular vocation is not remote and requires a lot of time in that particular location?
So I think again that we have to look at, what we're doing and if it's the passion that we have. So I will tell you that I was working 40 hours in an office. I don't know if anyone remembers Marlon Maddox and Point of View, but I syndicated his shows nationally across the country. So I worked at the USA Radio Network, and I worked there 40 hours a week. And I realized that I wanted something different. I was good at it, but I wasn't passionate. It took me an hour to drive there, an hour to drive back home. It took a lot of time away. And so I just told the Lord, I want to be in high tech. Like, I have no idea about high tech. I just said, I want to do it. And the story would take too long on this call to tell you, but basically God introduced me. I applied for a job at a company, and the only reason I got the job is because the guy who hired me was high on drugs and didn't know that I wasn't qualified. He never actually let me answer any questions. A whole hour of talking, he would ask a question and then he would answer it. And I didn't know what the job was. I just applied. I just sent resumes to every phone number in the paper. And he's the only one who called me back because he's high on drugs. Well, 3 months later, he goes to lunch, gets arrested, and doesn't come back. And the boss calls us in. I finally, about that time, figured out what we did. And the boss calls us in and says, okay, the manager, Craig, got arrested. We need a new manager. And there's 3 of us standing there. I just stepped forward like you see in a cartoon somewhere. I stepped forward and he said, you're manager. I didn't think about it. And so in 3 months, I'm now the manager. Right. And so I think that God, if we want to move forward and we're willing to take chances, that God will open up doors that will help us do the ministry that we want to do. I think, though, sometimes we have to look at the ministry that we're doing to say, it may be that God wants me in this place 40 hours a week for a reason. And so I need to look at that also. So there's got to be it's a bigger answer than just, hey, God will give you a remote job. It's really, what is God trying to do with you? And then finding happiness inside of that, and then doing it with everything you've got to work towards the next door that opens.
Okay, great. Josh Fritchie had a question that keyed in on just a statement that you made. Can you give us your top 5 tips for building great people, not organizations? He said that really struck a chord for him. And so when you talked about building great people, elaborate maybe a little bit. He asked for top 5. I don't know if you come up with that off the top of your head or not, but
So whether it's business or it's the church, I told my church that, listen, our job's not to build the church. Our job's to build great people, and then byproduct may be a church. But in from a work perspective, same thing, is that I feel my job is to find people with the it factor. In other words, my goal in church, it's just someone who has a desire. But in work, it may be somebody who has a passion, right? So they have what I call the it factor. And when I find people who have the it factor, then it's my job that I see them as a leader, or as a leader within whatever, that it's my job to help them understand how great they can be. And then because most people who are really going to be great don't believe that they're going to be great. Like, you got to convince them that they can be great. So I got to convince them to be great. And then once I can convince them that they have the potential to be great, then I've got to train them to be great. And then once I've trained them, I've got to create opportunity for them to be great. And then once I create the opportunity for them to be great, I have to celebrate the victories and push them to be better. And so that's how I work with people, is that I take anyone who has an ounce of the it factor inside of them, and it may take some people a lot longer, some people a lot shorter, but that's the road that I take them down. I've got to convince them. Once I convince them, I've got to train them. And once I train them, I've got to provide opportunities for them. And once I provide opportunities, I've got to celebrate what they're doing and then help them grow bigger.
oh,
That's
so
very basic, but that follows.
so good. Anybody else like to ask a question? Again, you can unmute yourself. You can type a question in the chat.
Can he show that balanced slide one more time? The last slide that he showed.
You betcha. This slide?
We're not seeing it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. That it?
No, sir. It was the one. Is there one more after that?
I've got this one, I've got this one, and I've got this one.
That's it. That's it right there. Thank you.
Yep.
And as he mentioned, he will send me some links to Facebook and that kind of stuff. When I send out the email confirming that the lesson has been downloaded to YouTube, then we'll include all of that in that email with the links to those various things.
And let me tell you, when a church gets a hold of understanding this, their ability, this is not just a work thing. This is people understanding that they can do so much more in ministry. They can do so much more in they're not prisoner to their shortcomings. I'm not a prisoner to the fact that I don't read well. I mean, Brother Engel, you know that you've sat across the table from me. I don't come across that I don't read well, but I don't, and it drives me crazy. I've got friends who are like, well, what books have you read? I'm like, the Bible, somewhat. I mean, lately, right? And they're like, well, you got to read books. You can't succeed if you're not reading books. Well, yes, you can. You can, right? You can succeed, but we can't be boxed in by our limitations, because if we are boxed in our ability, from a vocation perspective, we're absolutely going to be boxed in from a ministry perspective. 100%. And we're going to be boxed in from a same perspective. So this is a much bigger thing than just ministry, I feel.
Yeah. So good. So good. We got 1 or 2 minutes left. So again, if you want to submit a question via chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask, we've got just a couple of minutes. I want to be very respectful of his time, and yours as well. So anybody else?
So just so you know, I've got I've got a couple downstairs in our living room waiting that we're mentoring, that as soon as I leave this call, I'm headed down there to go do that with my wife to help mentor them. But I really do live what I'm talking about 100%.
Well, so good. Well, again, Brother McCurrach, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we appreciate the wisdom that you've shared. You've navigated that type of lifestyle for a number of years. Any insight that you might give kind of as a closing commentary on, if you're debating back and forth, maybe your church has grown large enough that you might go full time. Any thoughts, insights into when that might be a good transition, or if it ever should be a transition?
I think it's a God thing. So I think if I'm 55 years old. Okay, so I'm 55 years old. I figure I probably got 7 or 8 years personally until I retire and turn things over to somebody. And so I don't see, like, for me, an opportunity to go full time until I retire. And then I'm going to do all the stuff I really want to do, set of stuff I've got to do. But I think that going full time, I evangelized for 10 years, and I worked for 10 years while I evangelized. Every single day I worked for 10 years, but I never accepted an offering, and I paid all of my own expenses for 10 years. So I could go to home missions churches, that's what we called them back then. I could go to any church that needed someone versus what I had to do. So I've always looked at this differently than the typical person has, or the typical person that I run into has. And so, but I think that it's a God thing, that when God opens up a door, that he will guide you through it, and you'll know that it's the right time to do it. I don't think that there's a formula, a certain number of people, because like I said, for me right now, I'm so flexible that I would probably hire 5 other people in different positions before I would go full time, just because I have extreme flexibility.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us, brethren. Maybe there might be a couple of sisters on the call. Been so glad to be with you again. We hope to see all of you at NC3 next week, in fact. So God bless you.
And if anyone, I'm so sorry, if anyone ever has any questions, or you can always reach out to me. I'm on Facebook. I haven't figured out Instagram yet, but I'm on Facebook, and you feel free to reach out to me.
All right. Well, very good. God bless. Bye-bye.